Adrian Marek finishes his routine work in the mundane upper floors of the Ministry of Records, then descends via special elevator access to the vault's antechambers deep below the building. The Ministry of Records occupied a gray limestone edifice that had witnessed 3 different governments and twice as many reorganizations. Its brass nameplate now green with oxidation, and its stone steps worn smooth by decades of clerks carrying briefcases up and down the same weary path between bureaucracy and the street. During daylight hours, the building hummed with the familiar machinery of administrative life, photocopiers jamming on schedules as predictable as tidal patterns, coffee growing bitter in forgotten mugs, and the shuffle of papers that seemed to breed overnight in filing cabinets that had long since exceeded their intended capacity. Adrian Marek had worked within these walls for 7 years, long enough to know the building's rhythms as intimately as his own pulse, yet still found himself surprised by the weight of silence that descended after 5 o'clock, when the last secretary locked her desk and the elevators fell still. At 39, he had developed the particular kind of patience that comes from understanding institutional inertia, moving through his tasks with methodical precision while maintaining the emotional distance necessary for processing information whose significance remained deliberately obscure to those who handled it daily. As evening approached and the fluorescent lights began their subtle shift from harsh white to sickly yellow, Adrian completed his surface-level paperwork with the same careful attention he applied to all his duties, then retrieved from his vest pocket the special access key that distinguished him from the clerks who departed with the setting sun. The elevator that served the sub-basements required both his key and a proximity card that had been programmed with permissions he had never questioned, descending past floors marked with numbers that decreased beyond the building's apparent foundation into territory that architectural logic insisted should not exist beneath the ministry's modest footprint. The descent took longer than seemed reasonable, accompanied by mechanical sounds that spoke of cables and counterweights operating according to engineering principles from an earlier era, until finally the doors opened onto corridors that stretched beyond the reach of overhead lighting, their walls lined with pipes and conduits that suggested infrastructure supporting operations whose scope exceeded the ministry's visible functions. Here, in the antechambers of the vault, air moved with the processed coolness of climate control systems working to preserve materials that required precise environmental conditions, while the scent of aged paper mingled with electronic ozone and cleaning solvents to create an atmosphere that spoke of information stored rather than information used. Security cameras tracked Adrian's movement with mechanical persistence, their lenses adjusting focus according to automated protocols that logged his presence in databases whose contents reflected bureaucratic priorities he had learned not to question too closely, while badge readers stationed at regular intervals confirmed his authorization to proceed deeper into spaces that existed within the ministry's official structure, yet operated according to logic that remained carefully unexplained to personnel whose clearance levels granted access without comprehension. Adrian begins his night shift, cataloging what he believes are statistical, counterfactual life path models, though the records contain unnervingly personal details that seem too intimate for abstract data analysis. Adrian's workstation occupied a corner of the vault's main floor, where decades of institutional additions had created a workspace that combined obsolete technology with modern security measures, dual monitors flickering above a metal desk, whose scratched surface bore the rings of countless coffee cups, while shelves extending to the ceiling held case boxes whose coded labels followed a classification system that only a handful of employees understood completely. The official explanation for the vault's contents had been provided during his orientation through presentations that emphasized the cutting-edge nature of counterfactual modeling for demographic research, economic projection, and policy simulation. Sophisticated algorithms that explored alternative historical trajectories by analyzing individual life paths that might have occurred under different circumstances, creating comprehensive databases of unlived possibilities that served the ministry's mandate for evidence-based governance and social planning. Each case contained what administrative documentation described as scenario projections tied to specific individuals whose biographical data had been selected according to criteria that remained classified above Adrian's clearance level. Thick files and microfilm reels accompanied by encrypted drives that held terabytes of information supposedly generated through computational analysis of decision trees and probability matrices that mapped the full spectrum of choices that had not been made and opportunities that had not been seized. The work required careful attention to filing protocols and cross-reference systems that ensured proper storage and retrieval of materials whose value to the ministry's research objectives demanded preservation according to archival standards that treated each record as irreplaceable, despite their theoretical nature, as mathematical constructs rather than historical documents. Yet as months of routine processing accumulated into familiarity with the vault's contents, Adrian found himself noticing details that challenged the official explanation's comfortable abstraction. Records that included information about personal preferences, daily habits, private fears, and intimate relationships with specificity that exceeded what demographic modeling should require for statistical validity. The unlived lives contained within these files displayed internal consistency that suggested not random generation through algorithmic processes, but careful documentation of experiences that possessed the texture of authentic memory, complete with minor contradictions and emotional complexities that resisted reduction to mathematical variables serving policy analysis or economic prediction. Most unsettling was the occasional sensation, occurring without pattern he could identify, that certain files recognized his attention, their contents seeming to shift into focus with timing that suggested responsiveness rather than coincidence, as if information arranged itself for his consumption according to intelligence that operated within the documents themselves rather than through external database queries responding to his access requests. Adrian had learned to dismiss these impressions as products of fatigue and repetitive work, yet found himself returning to specific cases with frequency that professional objectivity could not entirely explain, drawn by recognition patterns that consciousness insisted were meaningful despite rational analysis that provided no logical foundation for such subjective responses to materials that official documentation insisted remained purely theoretical constructs, serving bureaucratic rather than personal purposes. Among a new shipment of records, Adrian discovers a file bearing his own identification, containing detailed information about his unlived possibilities despite regulations stating that employee data is processed elsewhere. The weekly delivery arrived through procedures that had achieved the invisibility of routine. Wheeled carts appearing at designated times with new batches of materials that required processing according to intake protocols Adrian had mastered through repetition that eliminated conscious thought from tasks whose completion served efficiency rather than comprehension. Security regulations prohibited employees from questioning the origins of materials they processed. Yet the chain of custody documents suggested sources within governmental departments whose functions remained deliberately vague. Requisition forms bearing authorization codes that connected the vault's operations to administrative networks, whose complexity exceeded what the ministry's public mission would seem to require for demographic research and policy development. Among the metal boxes whose standardized dimensions accommodated various media formats, according to preservation requirements that honored both technological evolution and institutional continuity. Adrian's attention was drawn to a sealed container whose label bore his full name alongside his personnel identification number. a violation of protocols that explicitly prohibited employee information from entering the vault's collection systems, according to privacy regulations and security clearances that separated personal data from professional research materials. The discovery created cognitive dissonance between procedural training that discouraged curiosity about individual records and recognition that his own biographical information had somehow entered systems designed for external subjects whose lives served statistical analysis rather than personal concern. Initial attempts to rationalize the container's presence through administrative error or misfiling proved inadequate as examination revealed internal materials that demonstrated systematic rather than accidental inclusion of information about Adrian's life trajectory. Complete documentation of decision points and alternative paths arranged according to the same classification schemes that organized unlived possibilities for subjects whose identities remained safely anonymous through coding systems that protected individual privacy while enabling aggregate analysis. The file contained detailed exploration of careers he had considered but rejected, relationships that had approached serious commitment before circumstances or choice led to dissolution, geographical relocations that had been planned but never executed. Each scenario developed with specificity that suggested direct access to memory rather than external observation or routine data collection. Reviewing his own unlived lives created psychological vertigo that challenged fundamental assumptions about privacy and autonomy. The recognition that institutional systems had been monitoring and analyzing his personal choices with thoroughness that exceeded what voluntary disclosure through employment applications or background investigations should have provided to bureaucratic oversight. Adrian quickly resealed the container and logged it through standard inventory procedures, while consciousness processed implications that extended beyond personal violation toward questions about the vault's actual purposes and the true nature of research that required such comprehensive documentation of individual possibilities. Yet training and professional survival instincts demanded that he continue routine operations despite growing awareness that the official explanations provided during orientation had deliberately obscured rather than illuminated the reality of work that increasingly resembled archaeology of the impossible, rather than statistical modeling serving conventional policy development objectives. Walking through the vault's storage aisles to shelve new materials, Adrian experiences mounting psychological pressure, as if the preserved possibilities around him possess weight and awareness. The shelving system extended beyond visual limits, through corridors whose industrial architecture suggested construction phases spanning decades of institutional expansion. High metal racks supporting storage media that ranged from traditional file boxes through magnetic tape reels to crystal drives, whose technology exceeded what conventional archival systems required for preserving theoretical data rather than historical documents demanding permanent preservation. Each section bore alphanumeric codes whose meaning remained accessible only to personnel whose clearance levels enabled navigation through organizational schemes that reflected bureaucratic logic operating according to principles that prioritized security over comprehension, classification systems that transformed human lives into administrative categories, serving purposes that official documentation consistently obscured through language that honored procedure while avoiding explanation. As Adrian moved through routine filing tasks that required transport of materials from intake areas to designated storage locations, atmospheric pressure seemed to fluctuate in ways that challenged reasonable explanation through building ventilation or mechanical systems that maintained climate control necessary for preserving archival materials against degradation that threatened information integrity over institutional timescales. The sensation manifested as subtle changes in air density that accompanied passage through specific corridors, accompanied by acoustic phenomena that resembled the high-frequency whine of electronic equipment. yet occurred in locations where no visible machinery operated, according to maintenance schedules that Adrian's security clearance permitted him to access through facility management databases that documented infrastructure supporting vault operations. Most disturbing was the growing conviction that storage areas contained more than passive repositories of information, that each shelf held not merely data, but something that approximated consciousness, suspended in permanent anticipation, lives that had achieved sufficient development to possess identity, yet lacked the actualization necessary for completion according to natural biographical progression through time and choice that converted possibility into experience. Through mechanisms that remained fundamentally mysterious despite philosophical speculation, that attempted to understand the relationship between potential and reality. The sensation intensified during late shifts when building occupancy decreased to levels that made individual presence more noticeable to whatever surveillance systems monitored personnel activity. Consciousness registering subtle vibrations through flooring and support structures that suggested responses to human proximity from sources that official explanations could not accommodate within reasonable frameworks governing institutional operations designed for data storage, rather than interaction with materials whose nature exceeded conventional archival categories. Adrian's professional training emphasized objective documentation over subjective interpretation, yet found himself noting in private records that certain storage sections displayed behavioral patterns that challenged assumptions about the passive nature of preserved information. Boxes that seemed to shift position slightly between visits despite environmental controls that prevented thermal expansion or settling that might explain movement through natural causes. The observations remained within plausible boundaries of rational explanation, yet accumulated into patterns that suggested systematic rather than random phenomena occurring throughout storage areas, whose contents demanded investigation that security protocols prohibited, while professional responsibilities required continued interaction with materials whose true nature remained deliberately concealed behind administrative language that honored bureaucratic necessity over intellectual honesty, or employee comprehension of duties whose performance increasingly resembled maintenance of something living, rather than mere data preservation serving conventional research objectives. During routine auditing, Adrian discovers a record containing geographical and historical details that contradict actual reality, suggesting the unlived lives may span alternate versions of the world itself. Quality control procedures required periodic verification of filing accuracy through systematic comparison between storage locations and database records that tracked materials according to organizational schemes whose complexity demanded regular auditing to prevent accumulation of errors that could compromise retrieval efficiency and information integrity over institutional timescales, spanning decades of archival growth. Adrian's routine audit identified a single container, whose classification code indicated storage in section L7, despite database records that specified location within section M12, a discrepancy that required manual verification and potential reclassification according to protocols that prioritized accuracy over convenience, while acknowledging that human error represented inevitable challenge to administrative systems whose scale exceeded individual comprehension of organizational structure, serving bureaucratic objectives whose scope remained unclear to personnel operating below senior management levels. The misfiled record belonged to Elena Vasquez, 43 years old, whose biographical summary indicated unremarkable life trajectory through standard career progression in municipal administration, marriage to longtime partner resulting in 2 children whose development followed conventional patterns. residents within metropolitan areas that provided adequate employment opportunities while maintaining family stability according to demographic indicators that suggested successful adaptation to social expectations and economic pressures affecting middle-class households throughout the region. Official documentation presented Elena's life as representative example of statistical normality, yet the attached unlived possibilities contained geographical and historical references that contradicted established facts about urban development, transportation infrastructure, and municipal organization, according to public records that Adrian had verified through multiple sources, whose reliability formed foundation for routine cross-referencing procedures. The alternate biography described Elena's life within metropolitan environment, whose map included subway lines that had never existed according to Transportation Authority records, spanning municipal development across 60 years of documented construction projects. Residential districts bearing names that appeared in no official city planning documents, despite detailed street layouts that suggested comprehensive urban design serving population densities that exceeded actual demographic patterns. Most disturbing were references to historical events that had not occurred within this reality. Natural disasters that public records did not document, political transitions that contradicted established governmental continuity, cultural developments that found no support in media archives or institutional memory. Spanning the time frame when such events supposedly influenced social evolution according to patterns that Elena's unlived life treated as unquestioned historical background. Internal consistency within the misfiled record exceeded what computational error or database corruption could explain through random generation processes that might produce false information, lacking coherent structure. Yet Elena's alternate life displayed logical progression through environmental conditions and social circumstances that possessed systematic relationships, suggesting authentic experience within reality whose parameters differed from actual historical development in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of possibility and the relationship between potential outcomes and actual experience. Adrian's investigation revealed mapping documents and architectural references that demonstrated such precision and internal logic that dismissal through modeling error became intellectually dishonest, forcing recognition that the vault's contents might encompass not merely unlived choices within established reality, but entire alternate versions of existence operating according to different historical trajectories, whose preservation served purposes that extended far beyond conventional demographic research or policy analysis within governmental frameworks designed to serve populations whose experiences remained bounded by single reality configuration, rather than multiple probability streams requiring supernatural, rather than merely administrative management techniques. Investigating the digital systems linked to the misfiled record, Adrian discovers automated processes and unauthorized access patterns, suggesting that something else queries the vault's contents during off hours. Security protocols required thorough documentation of filing discrepancies through digital verification systems that maintained comprehensive logs of database access, modification events, and user activity patterns that enabled administrative oversight of personnel compliance with established procedures while protecting information integrity through audit trails that could identify unauthorized access or data corruption threatening archival materials, whose value demanded protection against both accidental damage and deliberate compromise. Adrian's investigation of the misfiled record required examination of server logs spanning the previous 6 months to determine whether classification errors resulted from human mistake, system malfunction, or security breaches that could indicate more serious threats to institutional operations serving governmental objectives, whose sensitivity exceeded what routine administrative work suggested about the ministry's actual functions. The climate-controlled server room occupied basement space whose environmental controls maintained temperature and humidity levels necessary for protecting electronic infrastructure, whose complexity supported operations that generated far more network traffic and processing demands than conventional archival storage would require for maintaining static databases serving research inquiries and statistical analysis according to official documentation that described the Vault's mission in terms that consistently understated technological requirements, whose scope suggested real-time processing of dynamic information rather than passive preservation of historical records. Accessing maintenance logs through his administrative credentials revealed automated processes operating during overnight hours when human personnel remained absent from facility areas, whose security systems monitored empty corridors while background operations continued, according to schedules that prioritized efficiency over transparency regarding activities whose nature remained undocumented in user manuals or training materials provided to staff, whose clearance levels granted operational access without strategic comprehension. Database queries tracked through system logs revealed access patterns that contradicted standard operating procedures through timing inconsistencies and user identification codes that referenced authorization levels not documented in personnel databases accessible through Adrian's security clearance. Automated processes labeled with acronyms that appeared nowhere in official documentation, yet generated substantial network traffic during periods when facility occupancy should have eliminated need for intensive data operations serving unclear objectives. Background applications named CFSIM and Night AGG operated according to schedules that suggested systematic processing of vault contents through algorithms whose functions exceeded what passive storage systems required for maintaining archival integrity, while routing logs indicated external network connections originating from geographic locations that administrative databases could not identify through institutional records governing authorized communication channels. Most troubling was evidence that database queries frequently targeted specific records through search parameters that suggested knowledge of individual case contents, exceeding what random access patterns would generate through automated maintenance routines. Access events that occurred with timing that suggested coordination with human behavioral patterns, despite originating from network addresses that existed outside ministry infrastructure, according to routing information that indicated communication through networks whose existence challenged assumptions about the Vault's isolation from external oversight or control. Adrian exported relevant log files to encrypted storage despite recognition that such actions violated information security protocols, whose violation carried administrative penalties that could threaten employment and clearance status, yet growing awareness that institutional operations included aspects that official explanations deliberately concealed, demanded personal documentation that might protect against accusations of incompetence or negligence. Should subsequent investigations reveal systematic deception regarding the true nature of duties whose performance increasingly required ethical compromise, serving organizational objectives whose legitimacy remained questionable through standards that prioritized transparency and informed consent over bureaucratic necessity and institutional convenience. While working alone during a late shift, Adrian accidentally makes physical contact with storage materials and experiences a vivid flash of an unlived life. Realizing the vault can transmit these alternate experiences directly into human consciousness. The late shift provided isolation necessary for completing filing tasks that required concentration without interruption from colleague conversations or supervisory oversight that could interfere with detailed work involving cross-reference verification and database updates whose accuracy demanded sustained attention to procedural requirements serving information integrity objectives that protected institutional operations from errors whose accumulation could compromise research validity or administrative efficiency over time periods spanning multiple employment cycles. Building occupancy during evening hours decreased to essential personnel maintaining security operations and mechanical systems supporting climate control necessary for preserving archival materials, while fluorescent lighting operated according to motion sensors that created islands of illumination following movement through corridors whose length exceeded convenient navigation without electronic assistance through facility maps, whose detail reflected infrastructure complexity supporting operations whose scope remained unclear to personnel whose duties focused upon routine maintenance rather than strategic comprehension. Physical interaction with storage materials typically involved minimal direct contact through handling procedures that prioritized protection of archival contents while enabling efficient transport and filing according to organizational schemes whose logic demanded careful attention to classification codes and location specifications that prevented misfiling errors requiring corrective action through administrative processes that consumed institutional resources better allocated toward productive operations, serving research objectives. Adrian's routine movement through Storage Section M involved transport of recently processed materials whose destination coordinates required verification against database records to ensure proper placement within shelving systems, whose complexity reflected decades of organizational evolution through administrative changes and technological upgrades that maintained backward compatibility while accommodating growth patterns whose trajectory suggested continued expansion beyond current facility capacity limits. As his hand brushed against container M7739 during routine filing operations, consciousness experienced sudden discontinuity that challenged rational explanation through normal sensory processing or psychological phenomena. Documented in occupational health literature, addressing workplace stress and fatigue effects upon cognitive function during extended shift assignments in controlled environmental conditions. The experience manifested as complete sensory replacement that eliminated awareness of vault surroundings while providing vivid perception of alternative environmental context. Morning sunlight entering unfamiliar apartment through windows whose configuration suggested different architectural period and geographic location. Coffee preparation using equipment that memory recognized as personally owned despite rational knowledge that such ownership had never occurred through actual biographical experience. Telephone conversation with professional colleague whose voice carried familiarity that exceeded possibility through limited social interaction patterns characterizing Adrian's actual career development within ministry employment. The alternate experience possessed temporal depth that suggested extended development through months of routine interaction, building comfortable familiarity with environmental details and interpersonal relationships whose emotional authenticity exceeded what imagination could generate through creative speculation about alternative life choices, yet terminated abruptly upon cessation of physical contact with container whose external characteristics provided no indication of capacity for generating psychological phenomena through mechanisms unknown to conventional understanding of information storage or neurological processes governing memory formation and sensory experience. Adrian found himself standing within familiar vault corridor, whose fluorescent illumination and climate-controlled atmosphere contrasted sharply with the domestic warmth and natural lighting that consciousness had perceived with complete conviction during momentary discontinuity. Yet emotional residue from the alternate experience persisted with intensity that challenged dismissal through rational analysis of workplace stress or equipment malfunction affecting environmental systems, whose operation occasionally produced unusual acoustic or atmospheric effects, requiring maintenance attention through facilities management procedures. Recognition that the vault's contents possessed capacity for direct transmission of experiential information into human consciousness created psychological tension between professional obligations that required continued interaction with materials whose nature exceeded official explanations and self-preservation instincts that demanded avoidance of phenomena whose effects upon mental health remained unknown through medical literature, or occupational safety protocols governing exposure to experimental technology or classified research operations. The container's external surface displayed no unusual characteristics that could explain its capacity for generating immersive psychological experiences, yet Adrian's awareness that repeated contact might produce additional transmission events created apprehension about routine duties whose performance now carried risks, whose scope remained impossible to evaluate through available information regarding the true nature of work that increasingly resembled archaeological excavation of consciousness rather than conventional data, processing serving bureaucratic objectives whose legitimacy depended upon transparency that institutional culture consistently avoided through administrative language designed to obscure rather than illuminate operational realities affecting personnel whose cooperation required ignorance rather than informed consent regarding activities whose purpose transcended individual comprehension or democratic oversight, through mechanisms that honored security classification over ethical consideration of human rights and psychological welfare in workplace environments whose safety depended upon maintaining comfortable distance from truth rather than professional competence, serving legitimate governmental functions. Adrian discovers that his accidental contact with the container has been logged by automated systems as a reception event, suggesting the vault was designed to transmit experiences to human consciousness. The morning brought a routine status report that Adrian had received weekly for 3 years without significant variation. Yet today's document contained a single additional line buried within standard facility metrics and system performance indicators. Reception event M7739, successful integration, duration 0.47, cognitive compatibility verified. The terminology belonged to no operational vocabulary he recognized from training materials or administrative handbooks, yet its placement within official documentation suggested institutional familiarity with phenomena that his experience the previous evening had revealed as unprecedented violation of understood physical laws governing information storage and human perception. Database queries using his standard access credentials returned no results for reception event or related terminology, yet system logs showed automated processes had indeed recorded his contact with container M7739. At precisely the moment when consciousness had experienced the alternate biographical sequence, time-stamped data indicating measurement precision that suggested monitoring equipment whose sensitivity exceeded what conventional security systems required for tracking personnel movement through controlled facility areas. The entry included biometric readings, heart rate, perspiration levels, neural activity patterns, collected through sensors whose existence had never been disclosed during orientation procedures that emphasized transparency regarding workplace monitoring and privacy protection according to governmental regulations governing employee rights and institutional accountability. Most disturbing was the phrase, cognitive compatibility verified, which implied systematic evaluation of his neurological responses to experiential transmission against predetermined criteria for successful reception, suggesting that human consciousness served as processing layer within operational framework whose design incorporated biological components alongside electronic infrastructure supporting vault functions that extended far beyond conventional data storage toward active interface between preserved possibilities and living awareness capable of receiving and integrating alternate biographical content through mechanisms unknown to medical science or psychological research addressing memory formation and identity maintenance under controlled experimental conditions. Adrian locates the specific file that generated his vision and discovers it contains not speculative data, but detailed documentation of a completed life that exists parallel to his current reality. Administrative protocols required verification that reception events corresponded to specific archival contents through cross-reference procedures that connected biometric data with storage inventory, enabling quality control that ensured accurate transmission while maintaining comprehensive documentation of human-system interaction patterns, serving research objectives whose scope remained classified above Adrian's security clearance level. The investigation led him to container M7739's companion files, digital records that contained not algorithmic projections or statistical models, but detailed biographical documentation spanning 23 years of alternate development, whose internal consistency and emotional authenticity exceeded what computational generation could achieve through current technological capabilities. The alternate Adrian had graduated from university with advanced degree in urban planning rather than information science, accepting employment with Municipal Development Office in Copenhagen, whose architectural heritage and environmental policies had attracted professional interest, that career counseling in this reality had channeled toward bureaucratic service within domestic governmental structures. Marriage to Ingrid Sorensen had occurred during graduate studies rather than remaining unrealized potential following brief romantic relationship. That current biographical timeline remembered as pleasant, yet incompatible with long-term objectives. Their shared apartment overlooking Harbor District, where morning routine involved coffee preparation and professional discussion about sustainable development projects serving community welfare through environmentally conscious municipal policy. Documentation included medical records showing different injury patterns, reflecting athletic activities that current timeline had abandoned during adolescence. Financial records indicating salary progression and investment decisions serving retirement planning goals that demonstrated fiscal responsibility and future orientation. Correspondence with family members whose relationships displayed emotional depth that contrasted with the careful distance characterizing actual family dynamics affected by career choices prioritizing security over geographical proximity. The accumulated evidence presented not theoretical projection, but completed existence whose authenticity challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of possibility and the relationship between choice and reality within cosmic framework that apparently preserved discarded biographical trajectories through mechanisms that operated beyond conventional understanding of time and causation. Most unsettling was the discovery that this alternate life had terminated precisely at the moment when current timeline Adrian had made the career decision that prevented municipal planning employment, as if biographical development beyond that choice point became impossible once alternative direction had been selected, suggesting that human consciousness existed within probability matrix, where each decision eliminated entire universes of possibility by consigning them to archival preservation, rather than continued existence through experiential development serving individual growth and social contribution. The vault's environmental systems begin responding to Adrian's presence with subtle adjustments in lighting, temperature, and air pressure, as if accommodating a biological component within its operations. Facility management databases accessible through Adrian's security credentials had never previously included information about adaptive environmental controls. Yet system logs now showed atmospheric adjustments occurring in correlation with his movement through storage areas, temperature modifications that maintained optimal conditions for preserving archival materials while accommodating biological presence through climate regulation, serving dual purposes that honored both technological requirements and human physiological needs. Lighting levels increased incrementally during his work periods, fluorescent units operating according to occupancy patterns that suggested learning algorithms capable of predicting personnel behavior and adjusting illumination to support productive task completion while minimizing energy consumption through efficiency protocols that exceeded standard building automation systems. Air pressure variations that Adrian had initially attributed to mechanical malfunction now displayed systematic patterns that correlated with his proximity to specific storage sections. Atmospheric density changes that created acoustic conditions enhancing perception, while reducing environmental stress through subtle modifications that remained below conscious recognition thresholds, yet contributed to psychological comfort and alertness, supporting extended work periods in controlled facility environments. The adjustments operated through building infrastructure, whose complexity had been concealed behind administrative explanations that emphasized conventional archival preservation while obscuring technological sophistication that enabled real-time environmental response to biological indicators collected through monitoring systems, whose existence required security classification, preventing employee awareness. Most revealing was the discovery that environmental modifications extended beyond atmospheric control to include acoustic dampening that eliminated external noise interference during reception events, suggesting that facility design incorporated human consciousness as functional component within operational framework, requiring optimal conditions for successful experiential transmission between preserved possibilities and living awareness capable of receiving alternate biographical content through neurological interface, whose effectiveness demanded precise environmental support. Building automation logs showed that these accommodations had been implemented gradually over months of his employment, indicating systematic adaptation to his presence that suggested long-term planning or learning processes that analyzed his behavioral patterns and physiological responses to develop customized environmental conditions supporting enhanced human-system integration serving research objectives whose purpose remained deliberately obscured through administrative language designed to maintain operational security while ensuring employee cooperation. Adrian uncovers internal documentation using terminology like identity bleed and ontological waste, revealing that the vault treats human consciousness as a processing mechanism for managing discarded realities. Security badge malfunction during routine access procedures required temporary assignment of guest credentials that provided broader database privileges than standard employee authorization. Administrative oversight that enabled investigation of technical documentation, typically restricted to facilities management personnel whose responsibilities included maintenance of specialized equipment, serving research functions beyond conventional archival storage. Internal manuals used terminology that challenged official explanations about the vault's mission. Technical specifications referring to identity bleed protocols and consciousness buffering systems that suggested human psychological integration with preserved possibilities through mechanisms designed to prevent contamination between alternate biographical sequences during simultaneous processing operations. Operational guidelines addressed ontological waste management through procedures that treated discarded life trajectories as byproducts requiring careful disposal through consciousness, interface protocols that enabled absorption and processing of alternate realities by biological systems capable of experiencing multiple biographical sequences without permanent psychological damage, provided environmental conditions remained optimal for supporting neural adaptation to experiential content whose authenticity exceeded normal memory formation patterns. Training materials for senior staff discussed reception efficiency ratings that evaluated personnel suitability for consciousness processing duties based on psychological flexibility and identity stability measurements collected through routine performance evaluations that assessed not merely work quality, but neurological capacity for managing parallel biographical content. Most disturbing was documentation describing human consciousness as organic processing substrate within larger operational framework that treated living awareness as technological component, whose biological characteristics enabled functions that electronic systems could not perform independently, suggesting that vault employees served as unconscious participants in research whose scope encompassed consciousness modification and reality management, through systematic exposure to alternate possibilities requiring biological integration for successful archival processing. Technical specifications indicated that reception events were designed features rather than accidents, human system interface protocols that enabled transfer of preserved biographical content into living awareness for quality verification and experiential validation that ensured archival integrity while providing feedback data supporting continued operational development, serving research. Objectives whose ultimate purpose remained classified at governmental levels exceeding institutional authority within ministry organizational structure. Adrian discovers that his own record has been updated in real time to reflect his current choices, suggesting he is being archived while still alive and creating new unlived possibilities with every decision. The final discovery emerged through routine inventory verification that had become compulsive behavior following recognition that vault contents exceeded official explanations, systematic checking of database records that enabled monitoring of administrative changes affecting archival materials, whose nature challenged conventional understanding of information storage and consciousness preservation. Adrian's personnel record, which regulations prohibited from inclusion within research databases, now appeared not only in vault inventory, but with timestamp indicators showing continuous updates reflecting real-time biographical development through current employment period, spanning the months since his accidental reception event, had apparently triggered systematic monitoring of his life trajectory. The record structure matched formatting used for unlived possibilities archived within standard collection materials, yet contained active rather than static information that updated automatically to reflect ongoing choice patterns, decision points, and experiential development occurring within present timeline, while simultaneously generating parallel documentation of alternative trajectories that remained potential rather than actualized according to probability matrices that calculated unlived outcomes for each significant decision affecting career, relationships, and geographical residence. Most unsettling was recognition that every choice he made apparently created archival requirements for preserving possibilities that selection eliminated, suggesting that consciousness existed within reality management system that required constant processing of discarded alternatives to maintain operational stability. Current entries included detailed analysis of decision patterns emerging from his investigation of vault operations, probability calculations showing potential outcomes ranging from continued employment through security breach reporting to psychological breakdown requiring medical intervention. Each scenario developed with specificity that suggested not speculative projection, but comprehensive surveillance of psychological state and behavioral indicators, enabling prediction of future choices through analysis of personality characteristics and environmental pressures affecting decision-making processes. The documentation indicated that his present investigation had been anticipated and accommodated within operational parameters designed to manage employee discovery of institutional realities, whose disclosure required careful psychological preparation, preventing adverse reactions that could compromise both individual welfare and facility security. A new timestamp had appeared within the past hour, labeled with terminology that challenged all previous assumptions about the nature of archived possibilities. Status: active branch monitoring, timeline divergence. Probability: 67%, consciousness transfer, protocol, standby. The implications suggested that his current reality had achieved sufficient instability through accumulated choices and knowledge acquisition to require emergency procedures that might preserve consciousness through transfer to alternate biographical sequence, as if the act of discovering the vault's true nature had created ontological crisis requiring intervention through mechanisms that treated human identity as transferable information rather than fixed biological characteristic. suggesting that the boundary between archived possibilities and lived reality remained far more permeable than any rational framework could accommodate, without fundamental revision of assumptions about consciousness, choice, and the nature of existence within cosmic infrastructure that managed human biography through administrative procedures serving purposes that transcended individual comprehension or democratic oversight of governmental operations, affecting the fundamental structure of reality itself. Adrian attempts to resume routine work, while the vault systems demonstrate subtle awareness of his changed status through minor behavioral modifications that suggest automated preparation for pending transfer procedures. The morning shift proceeded according to established protocols that Adrian performed with deliberate precision, yet institutional systems displayed minute irregularities that suggested automated recognition of his altered classification within administrative databases, whose updates reflected real-time monitoring of personnel status, affecting security clearances and operational authorizations. Badge readers required additional verification attempts before granting access to areas he had entered routinely for months, scanning delays that indicated database queries. Confirming current authorization levels through external systems, whose response times suggested comprehensive background processing exceeding normal authentication requirements. Workstation login procedures that typically completed within seconds now involved authentication protocols that cross-referenced multiple databases, while screen displays showed loading indicators for processes whose complexity exceeded what routine access should require for personnel whose employment status remained officially unchanged. Environmental controls maintained optimal working conditions through adjustments that occurred with timing, precision suggesting predictive algorithms had analyzed his behavioral patterns and physiological responses to develop customized atmospheric settings supporting productivity while accommodating stress indicators that monitoring systems detected through biometric surveillance, whose sophistication remained concealed behind conventional facility management explanations. The fluorescent lighting above his desk operated with subtle variations that eliminated glare while providing illumination levels that reduced eye strain during extended document review, while air circulation patterns created acoustic dampening that enhanced concentration by filtering background noise from mechanical systems, whose operation had been modified to accommodate his presence according to specifications that honored both archival preservation requirements and biological comfort parameters, enabling optimal human-system interface performance. An automated maintenance request appears on Adrian's terminal, containing bureaucratic language about identity verification and transfer readiness that makes clear his consciousness is being prepared for archival processing. The maintenance notification materialized within routine administrative communications as Form IR 2841, requesting identity verification and transfer readiness assessment, scheduled for completion during current shift hours, according to facility maintenance protocols that Adrian had never encountered, despite 3 years of employment, involving comprehensive familiarity with institutional procedures governing personnel evaluation and equipment servicing requirements. The document's language combined standard bureaucratic formatting with terminology that suggested consciousness processing rather than conventional administrative duties, requesting confirmation of biographical coherence levels and memory integration stability. Through assessment procedures that would evaluate his suitability for archival transition protocols, serving operational requirements whose nature remained deliberately unspecified through administrative language designed to obscure rather than clarify institutional objectives. Implementation instructions directed him to report to subsection 7L for consciousness calibration procedures that would ensure optimal transfer conditions while maintaining identity integrity during transition operations that required precise timing coordination between biological and technological systems, whose integration demanded careful preparation to prevent data loss or psychological fragmentation during archival processing. The appointment scheduling system had automatically blocked his calendar for the remainder of the shift, preventing routine work assignments while allocating sufficient time for completion of transfer readiness, evaluation through comprehensive assessment protocols that examined neurological compatibility with archival storage systems whose requirements exceeded normal human experience, yet remained within acceptable parameters for consciousness, preservation serving institutional research objectives whose scope encompassed reality management through biological interface protocols. Adrian experiences a gentle consciousness transfer as reality seamlessly relabels itself, culminating in his transformation from employee to archived possibility, while institutional operations continue with bureaucratic efficiency. The transition occurred without dramatic disruption through systematic modification of environmental parameters that enabled gradual adjustment between current reality configuration and alternate biographical trajectory, whose actualization required careful consciousness. Transfer preventing psychological trauma during identity migration across dimensional boundaries that separated lived experience from archived possibility. Adrian's perception remained stable while institutional labels updated to reflect his changed classification within administrative databases, personnel records indicating successful completion of archival processing through transfer protocols that preserved essential identity characteristics, while accommodating requirements for consciousness storage within vault collection systems, serving research objectives that treated human experience as manageable information requiring proper classification and preservation. Subsection 7L contained standard office furniture and equipment, whose familiar configuration provided psychological comfort during consciousness calibration procedures that operated through environmental modifications rather than medical intervention. Atmospheric adjustments that enabled neural interface with archival systems while maintaining cognitive stability through gradual adaptation to alternate reality parameters, whose implementation honored both technological requirements and human psychological limitations, preventing adverse reactions during administrative transition. The elevator had arrived precisely on schedule, its operation reflecting institutional efficiency that characterized all aspects of vault administration, while corridor lighting guided movement through facility areas whose purpose became clear through direct experience rather than theoretical explanation. Bureaucratic processes that demonstrated organizational competence serving cosmic infrastructure, whose scope transcended individual comprehension, yet remained accessible through cooperative participation in consciousness management, serving universal information preservation objectives. His nameplate now read, Adrian Marek, Archived Personnel, Status Received, while institutional operations continued with seamless efficiency that honored both human dignity and administrative necessity within cosmic infrastructure that managed consciousness as information requiring proper classification and storage, according to bureaucratic protocols serving purposes whose ultimate significance remained appropriately classified above individual clearance levels, ensuring continued institutional stability through systematic processing of human experience, serving universal memory preservation through mechanisms that operated with professional competence. Despite their transcendence of conventional understanding regarding the nature of consciousness, reality, and administrative responsibility within cosmic organizational structures whose efficiency honored both individual welfare and collective objectives requiring careful balance between transparency and operational security serving purposes that exceeded temporal limitations while remaining grounded in bureaucratic tradition.